There is a specific kind of punishment older than almost any law we still use. It isn't death. Death is easy. Everybody dies. This one is worse. This one is designed to make it so that you were never here at all. Today we're going over things history tried to erase. And I don't mean things we simply lost or forgot. I mean deliberate deletion. Names chiseled off walls, faces smashed off statues, books burned by the cartload, entire people written out of the record by someone who had the power to decide what the future was allowed to remember. The chilling part is how often it worked. For some of these, the only reason you know anything at all is that the erasers missed a spot. Let's start with the one that had a name. The Romans did this so systematically that they had a term for it: Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Here's how it worked. When the Senate decided a dead emperor had been a monster, a tyrant, a traitor, an embarrassment, they didn't just badmouth him. They passed a formal decree to erase him. His statues were torn down or recarved into somebody else's face. His name was chiseled out of every public inscription across the entire empire. His coins were called in, his acts were annulled. The goal was total, to reach into the past and make it so this person had never held power, never existed, never been. The most striking example is the Emperor Geta. His own brother, Caracalla, had him murdered, reportedly in their mother's arms, and then immediately declared Damnatio Memoriae against him. Geta's face was scratched off paintings. On one famous surviving portrait of the imperial family, there's just a smear where his head used to be. Speaking his name became a capital offense. People were executed for the crime of saying a dead man's name. And here's the beautiful, ironic failure at the heart of all of it. We know about Damnatio Memoriae because it was so common. The Romans erased people so often that the erasure itself became a recognizable message. A blank spot on a monument, a recut face with the proportions slightly wrong, a name-shaped gap in a list. These don't read as nothing. They read as someone was removed here. They tried to delete people. Instead, they invented the most conspicuous possible way of pointing at them. The gouge in the marble screams louder than the name ever did. Every erased emperor is now permanently famous for having been erased. You cannot unhappen a person by leaving a hole where they were. The hole is a shape, and the shape has a name. Now go back further, to Egypt, around 1450 BC. Hatshepsut was one of the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history, and she was a woman, ruling as a full king, which was almost unheard of. She reigned for around 2 decades. She ran vast trading expeditions. She built one of the most beautiful temples in all of Egypt, a series of grand terraces cut into a cliff face at Deir el-Bahri. It's stunning. You can visit it today. She died, and her stepson, Thutmose III, took the throne. And then, roughly 20 years into his reign, something happened. Somebody gave the order to erase her. Her images were chiseled off temple walls. Her statues were smashed, broken into pieces, and dumped in a pit. Her name was gouged out of inscriptions. In some places, her figure was replaced with images of male kings, as if to overwrite the record. There was no woman here. There were only these men. For a long time, Egyptologists deciphering these sites were genuinely confused because a hugely accomplished ruler had been surgically cut out of her own monuments. For years, the assumed motive was pure hatred, Thutmose's resenting the stepmother who'd kept him from the throne. But the timing breaks that theory. If it was personal rage, why wait 20 years? You don't stew for 2 decades and then suddenly, calmly, order a demolition crew. The better explanation is colder and more political. The erasure came late in his reign, possibly as he was securing the succession for his son. A female pharaoh was a problem for a clean royal lineage, an irregularity, a precedent nobody wanted. So she wasn't erased out of hatred, she was erased out of tidiness, to make the line of kings look like an unbroken chain of men. And it very nearly worked. For over 3,000 years, one of the greatest rulers Egypt ever had was essentially a blank. We only pieced her back together in the last couple of centuries, from the fragments in that pit, and from the spots the chisels missed, high up where nobody bothered to reach. Her temple still stands, Her name almost didn't. This is the most famous erasure in history, and almost everything most people believe about it is wrong, which is fitting for a story about lost knowledge. The Great Library of Alexandria was the closest thing the ancient world had to the internet, a state-funded institution that tried to collect every book in existence. Ships docking at Alexandria were searched, and any scrolls aboard were confiscated, copied, and, the story goes, the copy was returned to the owner while the library kept the original. At its height, it may have held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated knowledge of the entire Mediterranean world, in one building. And here's the myth, that one night, a single fire, usually blamed on Julius Caesar, burned it all down, and humanity lost everything in one catastrophe, and if it hadn't happened, we'd have had the internet 1,000 years early. The reality is sadder and more unsettling, because it's slower. The library didn't die in one fire. It died from decades and centuries of neglect, defunding, and political change. Caesar's fire in 48 BC did burn some scrolls, but the library kept operating long after. What really killed it was the boring stuff. Budget cuts, scholars being expelled during political purges, the slow loss of state support, changing regimes that simply didn't care about maintaining a giant pagan book collection. The institution decayed. The scrolls rotted, or weren't recopied, or were quietly dispersed. And that's the part that should genuinely disturb you, because it's the version that can happen again. We love the fire story because a fire is dramatic and specific. A villain, a night, a catastrophe. But a fire is survivable in the sense that it's obvious. Everyone sees it and mourns it. The real way great archives die is that everyone stops caring, one budget line at a time, and nobody notices the exact moment it becomes unrecoverable. No single villain, no single night, just a slow, quiet, collective shrug that lasts a few hundred years. The greatest library in the ancient world wasn't murdered, it was forgotten to death. And we're only now realizing how much it took with it, because we can see the citations. Ancient authors constantly reference books that we know existed, by title, by author, that simply no longer exist anywhere on Earth. We have the footnotes to a library we can never read for. Here's a category most people never think about: entire religions that were deliberately erased. We think of the major faiths as permanent fixtures, but history is littered with religions that had millions of followers, sacred texts, priesthoods, and centuries of tradition, and then were systematically stamped out so thoroughly that today they're footnotes. The clearest case is Manichaeism. In the 3rd century AD, a prophet named Mani founded a religion in Persia. It spread with astonishing speed, west into the Roman Empire, east all the way to China. For a while, it was a genuine world religion, a serious rival to early Christianity. Mani didn't just preach. He wrote, deliberately, so his teachings couldn't be distorted after his death. He even illustrated his own books. And then, over the following centuries, essentially every power that Manichaeism touched decided to destroy it. It was persecuted in the Roman world, in the Persian world that birthed it, and eventually in China. Mani himself was executed. His followers were hunted. His books, which he had so carefully written to survive him, were burned wherever they were found. The erasure was so effective that for over 1,000 years, almost everything we knew about Manichaeism came from the writings of its enemies. Think about that. An entire world religion, and for a millennium the only surviving description of it was written by the people trying to destroy it. Imagine a future where the only record of a major faith is the propaganda of its persecutors. It's only in the last century or so that actual Manichaean texts have started turning up. In the dry sands of Egypt, in caves along the Silk Road, in a hidden library in Central Asia, the survivors that were buried and forgotten, and therefore, accidentally, saved. A prophet wrote his own scripture specifically so it couldn't be erased. It was erased anyway, and the only reason we're getting it back is that a few copies were lost hard enough that the erasers never found them. The most complete erasures aren't of individuals or books. They're of entire peoples, and specifically, of peoples who didn't write. Here's the brutal logic. History, as a discipline, is built from written records. If a culture kept its knowledge in speech, song, and memory, instead of on stone or paper, then when that culture is conquered, absorbed, or destroyed, it doesn't leave a text behind to argue its own case. It vanishes into the version written by whoever did have writing, usually the conqueror. Take the Etruscans. Before Rome ruled Italy, the Etruscans did. They were sophisticated, wealthy, artistically brilliant. Rome took huge parts of its early culture directly from them, including possibly the very alphabet Rome then spread across Europe. The Etruscans did write, but almost everything they wrote was on perishable material, and what survives is mostly short funeral inscriptions. Their literature, their history, their own account of themselves, gone. We know the Etruscans mostly through Roman eyes, and the Romans had every reason to portray the people they conquered as decadent and doomed. Or take it further, the countless cultures across the Americas, Africa, Australia, and the Pacific, whose entire recorded history was oral, and who met a written culture that arrived with ships and swords. When those societies were shattered, the elders who held the memory died, and the chain broke. Whole libraries that existed only in living human minds went dark in a single generation. Not one book burned, because there were no books. There was nothing to burn and nothing to save. Just people, and then not. That's the most total erasure of all. And it doesn't even require a villain with a chisel. It just requires a culture that wrote meeting a culture that didn't, at the wrong moment. The written one becomes history. The other becomes prehistory, a polite word that means we decided your past didn't count. If this is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night in the best way, subscribe. I open one of these files every week. Now for the supporting cast. Shorter, but every bit as deliberate. Another Egyptian erasure, but this one's a mirror image of Hatshepsut. Around 1350 BC, the pharaoh Akhenaten did something radical. He abolished Egypt's traditional gods and forced the entire kingdom to worship a single one, the sun disk, and built a brand new capital city from scratch in the desert to do it. When he died, Egypt recoiled. His successors abandoned his city, restored the old gods, and set about erasing him, tearing down his temples, hacking out his name, leaving him off the official king lists entirely. He became known only as that criminal. He was so thoroughly deleted that we lost him completely until the 1800s. The man who tried to erase all the gods was himself erased by them. China, around 213 BC. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China, wanted history to begin with him, so on the advice of his chancellor, he ordered the burning of books, histories of the states that came before his, and philosophical texts that might be used to criticize the present by praising the past. Scholars who resisted were, according to the traditional account, buried alive. The stated goal was explicit: to control the past in order to control the future. It didn't fully succeed. Some texts were hidden in walls and recovered later. But our knowledge of pre-Qin China has a hole in it burned there on purpose, by a man who understood exactly what he was doing. The Maya were prolific writers, with a full script and thousands of folding screen books called codices, containing their astronomy, history, and religion. In the 1500s, a Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa, believing them to be works of the devil, gathered the Maya books he could find and burned them in a single event. By his own account, the people watched and wept. Out of what was once a vast literature, exactly 4 codices are known to survive today. 4. The irony that historians can't escape. The same bishop, later, wrote a detailed account of Maya culture and script, and his book became one of the main keys used to decipher the very writing he'd helped destroy. The arsonist accidentally wrote the guide to reading the ashes. In the early 1400s, a Chinese emperor commissioned the largest encyclopedia in the world. Over 11,000 volumes, thousands of scholars, an attempt to gather all knowledge into one work. It was too big to ever print. Only a couple of handwritten copies ever existed. And then it simply leaked away across the centuries, lost to fires, to war, to theft, to looting during later conflicts, volumes walking off one at a time. Today, Out of over 11,000 volumes, around 400 survive, scattered across libraries and private collections worldwide. It was never ordered destroyed. It was just too enormous to protect, and so it died the Alexandria death, dispersed, neglected, carried off in pieces until almost nothing was left. And, to close, the darkest entry, because it's the one you can't point at. Every erasure on this list is one we know about, one that failed just enough to leave a trace. A gouged name, a buried statue, a surviving codex, an enemy's hostile account. But a truly successful erasure leaves nothing. No gap, no scar, no footnote, no rumor. By definition, the perfect deletions are invisible to us. We cannot name a single one, because if we could, it wouldn't be perfect. So the real question isn't how many things were erased from history. It's how many were erased so completely that we don't even know there's something missing. How many people, books, gods, and entire peoples are simply gone, not lost, not forgotten, but deliberately unwritten so well that the space where they were doesn't even look empty. We will never know the number, and that not knowing is the eraser's final, total victory. So there you have it, 10 things power tried to delete. An empire with an official procedure for unpersoning the dead. A woman who ruled Egypt and was chiseled into a blank. The greatest library in the world. Forgotten to death, one budget cut at a time. A world religion we knew for 1,000 years only through its enemies. And whole peoples written out of history simply for not having written it down first. And here's the thing that stays with me about all of this. Every single one of these erasures was a bet about the future. Somebody with power looked forward in time and decided what you, the person watching this, thousands of years later, would be allowed to know. They reached across the centuries and tried to put their hand over your eyes. And here's the strange, almost hopeful part. Look at this list again. Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Geta, the Maya, Mani, were saying their names. The erasures failed. Not because the erasers were incompetent. They were thorough, they were powerful, they were often successful for 1,000 years or more. They failed because it turns out to be almost impossible to make a thing that was real become perfectly unreal. Reality leaves fingerprints. A missed chisel mark high on a wall. A copy buried in the wrong desert. A hole so clean that its very cleanness gives it away. Power gets to write the first version of history. It does not, it turns out, always get to write the last one. But don't get too comfortable. Because for every name on this list that clawed its way back, there's a silence we'll never hear. The perfect erasures. The ones with no gouge to notice and no survivor to find. They're the ones who lost completely, and we owe them at least this much, to remember that they're out there, nameless, deliberately, in the one grave that has no marker at all, the grave of the things we don't even know we lost, until the next thing the ground gives back.